Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to our webinar on tailings retreatment and rehabilitation. Our distinguished panel will discuss how best to untap the growth potential of tailings retreatment, as well as strategies to advance effective mine rehabilitation programs. In the wake of high-profile failures of certain tailings facilities around the world, questions abound regarding the adequacy of measures to secure these legacy sites. Our webinar today is sponsored by DRDGOLD, Weir Minerals Africa, and Jones & Wagener. We thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Before we begin, please be aware that we've enabled the Q&A facility, so please post any questions into the Q&A. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. Our panelists may not be able to answer all of your questions during today's webinar, but we will read through all of them. To encourage interaction, we've also enabled the chat facility, so you can post your comments in the chat. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please remember not to post your questions in the chat, though, as we may miss them. You can post your questions in the Q&A instead. Please be aware we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending the recording to you afterwards. We're also streaming the webinar live on YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Charles MacRobert, an Associate Professor of Geotechnical Engineering in the Department of Civil Engineering at Stellenbosch University. Charles is a professional engineer and provides specialized consulting for the characterization and modeling of geomaterials for global stability and seepage assessments. Charles will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Niël Pretorius, the CEO of DRDGOLD, Alice Harvey, Associate Civil Engineer in the Environmental Engineering Department's Closure and Rehabilitation Team at Jones & Wagener, Erik Vlot, Global Manager for Tailings and Backfill at Weir Minerals, and Dr. Kim Morton, who is on the Tailings Committee of the Southern African Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. I'll hand over now to the facilitator, Charles MacRobert, to start the discussion. Over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Shannon. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm coming through loud and clear. Welcome to this session. It's a very interesting time in tailings. I think last week or the week before, there was headlines made in South Africa about this invisible resource that is sitting within our tailings facilities. So hopefully we'll be able to unpack a little bit of that today. And I think I've got a group of students here this week who have been studying about how to store and manage tailings facilities safely. And one of the students asked me this morning, is there a future in tailings, or should they be reskilling? And I was like, I think that there's a big future in tailings, and you don't have to worry about that. So hopefully we'll unpack some of those issues today. And perhaps to start off with, we can ask Niël. I know that you have had a look at some of the research that's come out recently about the so-called invisible gold. And it's not just that. We have perhaps what we could call visible gold already that we are remining. So perhaps, just from a perspective of DRDGOLD, what are the future growth potentials in tailings remining in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think growing tailings, or the size of tailings extraction in South Africa, is more a case of extending the life of mine. In order to mine tailings economically viably, the volume throughput that you need to maintain is quite extensive. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that there's one site that we're mining from where we're processing the better part of 500,000 tons every month, and we're retrieving or recovering about 30 kilos of gold from that. So it gives you an indication. That obviously is one of the lower grade sites, but it gives you an indication of just what sort of throughput you've got to maintain in order to have a financially viable model. So in terms of growing tailings and production from tailings in South Africa, so far as that's concerned, it's very hard to just keep on increasing your volume throughput. The size of the plant infrastructure, the amount of power that you use, the amount of water that's required, the cost of reagents, all of that, it all adds up. So you're probably looking more at a situation where through new research, through an improvement of technologies, by small incremental increases or improvements in extraction efficiency, you can mine lower and lower grade materials, and including some of the more recent materials. So instead of only mining for another 20 years, you might be able to mine for another 40 years. And in fact, you might get to a point where the current tail, the second generation tail that's been created and that's now being stored centrally, where that could once again find its way through a plant. And that's where the research that's been published is actually quite exciting, because what it's telling us is that we're not getting all of it. Now, we know that we're not getting all of it, but there might be some of it that we didn't even know about. We thought it might be there. We thought that gold associated with sulfides might be in that ore body, so to speak, in almost at an atomic level or a submicroscopic level. And I think what Dr. Steve's now managed to do is find the technologies to actually confirm its presence, and to measure it to some sort of an extent, to express an opinion as to how much more there could be. And if it's there, obviously, it's worth your while to start looking at technologies to start mining it at scale. So, yeah, that's a long answer for a short question, for a simple question. But I think the answer is yes. There's undoubtedly there's a long and hopefully attractive future in the extraction of minerals from tailings in South Africa.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess the next question that we would have, and I'm going to ask Dr. Kim Morton, this one in particular, would you be able to maybe give us an estimate of just how many of these facilities are out there that we could potentially remine, and that are also in need of rehabilitation, for that matter as well?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at the statistics, there's over 2,000 active mines in South Africa, including quarries. And I think we're having a very broad generalization for what a TSF is, basically any storage facility that is tailing size. And over that, there's also about 6,000 unrehabilitated or dormant or abandoned mining dumps. So what's significant is, I mean, the whole purpose of this webinar is what are the opportunities? And then there's massive opportunities for South Africa in improving the way they manage their TSFs, the active and the abandoned ones. And of course, as Niël mentioned, this latest paper on extracting molecular gold, I think that's a leap forward. But what's even more exciting is that the possible use of these tailings dams for building materials, for example. And the opportunities are enormous. We've got, I think, about 337 that are high risk that need immediate attention. And as you know from Jagersfontein and sadly Brumadinho, and before that Merriespruit, it does need to be addressed. So the DMR really needs to lead the way with making these TSFs more safe. But what has been happening through the industry is most of the mining houses are stepping up and finding that there is opportunity to improve their social license by increasing the amount of effort they put into managing their TSFs. And I'm sure everyone around South Africa is familiar with the mine dumps you can see every day, central Johannesburg, Belkom, all along the Witwatersrand belt. And what the Southern African Institute of Mining Metallurgy is doing is through our tailings direction board, is we've got about 20 people on the committee that are across the whole industry and very interested in advancing tailings management and getting it to the forefront of expenditure for mining companies and to the forefront of the DME and Department of Water Affairs. Because as you know, the reason I got involved in the tailings space is because a lot of tailings dams have a significant amount of water in them. And what's been happening, sadly, around the world is everyone's hooked on monitoring the movement of the tailings dam. And of course, when a tailings dam starts moving, it's too late to stop it. You actually have to monitor the cause. And one of the biggest causes once a tailings dam is erected or once a slope is established is the weight of water in that slope. A wet slope is far more unstable than a dry slope. So there's great opportunity there to advance monitoring of the volumes of water in the tailings dam, the pore pressures affecting the slope stability, and then put in mitigation methods to drop those water pressures and reduce the head of water, reduce the weight of water in that slope, and therefore increase the safety factor in situ. And that is being, we are definitely leading the way in South Africa. Companies like Insight Terra and TechWise are installing a huge amount of instrumentation into tailings dams so that the companies that manage them and the governments that have to monitor them understand that we're looking at the cause, not the result of the weight of water and the failure. So I think that's a very exciting arena at the moment. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question completely, but I think I've raised a number of points that will interest people with regards to the future of managing our tailings. And I know your students are very excited about managing them throughout Southern Africa. And that's the other important point, is the SAIMM is the Southern African Institute of Mining Metallurgy, not just the South African Institute. And we have numerous members in the Congo, in Mozambique and Angola that are all leaping forward to embrace South African technology and drive better management of TSS forward.
Thanks. Yeah, so my initial question was really around how many we've got, and obviously there are a lot and that need rehabilitation and remining, and there's a whole ecosystem that goes around that. And perhaps my next question, I'll come to Alice from Jones and Wagener, and my question is how does remining and rehabilitation how is it that we combine these two things? And shouldn't we just leave them alone? Why is there this synergy between rehabilitation and remining? And perhaps touch on how Jones and Wagener are able to assist in that process.
So, yeah, I think one of the things, sort of misnomers when we remine, people not in the industry don't necessarily understand that tailings still needs to be deposited somewhere. So I think that's the first thing, is that the tailings doesn't disappear. We remine it, we extract the minerals that we're looking for, and that tailings needs then to be managed. However, the legislation has changed, the guidelines have changed, the processes that we use have changed, our stability assessments have improved significantly. And so when we remine tailings, it typically needs to be placed in facilities that are better managed and better controlled than the historical facilities. Things like, for example, we're now requiring that a lot of the facilities are lined. Whereas historically they wouldn't be, and that would have a groundwater impact. Stability assessments, as I say, have improved and changed, and we're seeing that significant change in the way that we assess stability. So when things are remined and placed in, say, Niël referred to a central facility, there's more onerous conditions for managing safety and environmental impacts from those facilities. And then not many of these facilities have been successfully rehabilitated. So Dr. Kim referred to over 6,000 abandoned mines in the country. That onus sits with government to manage those facilities. Typically, they're not being managed. They haven't been fully rehabilitated. So they're sitting there. They do still have existing risks and environmental impacts and safety risks that are not necessarily being managed. If they're then seen as a resource and remined, then there's more control about what happens to them.
You mentioned the word central facility. Maybe you can just elaborate on what you mean by that term.
So I think we can ask Niël refer to that, but I think typically a lot of the tailings that were deposited are in smaller facilities and now are being managed more centrally in larger facilities. Niël, I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So all of the material that we are reclaiming in the Johannesburg area, and for that matter in the West Rand as well, we don't send any of that back to its original, to the original site where it was being reclaimed from. once it's processed, it gets sent to for final storage. It gets sent to a large central facility that is obviously managed to a different set of standards than the standards that applied when tailings were established initially. And where the things that Dr. Kim was referring to earlier, in terms of maintaining a particular safety factor, whilst at the same time also ensuring that that the impact that this facility has on the environment, that is also properly managed, where all of those systems are in place. And also importantly, we talk about the visibility of this. Obviously, the objective is then for this facility to at some point in time become barely visible, and you do that by way of cladding, by way of re-establishing vegetation on the sides of this facility. And this is something that you need to start with early on in the life of the facility, because it's going to cost you so much money over time that if you leave it right up until the end, then you're just not going to be able to do that. So when you posed the question earlier, Charles, of what's meant by rehabilitation through the reclamation of tailings, that's pretty much part of it. The whole process of lifting the material from where it is at the moment and cleaning up those sites and returning them either for sustainable use or restoring the initial environmental state of that site. And then also ensuring that the final storage facility is managed to a particular standard. All of those things need to take place, but it's either intrinsic in the process or it needs to take place as you go along, because you won't be able to do it after the revenue flows have stopped from the production of product.
I think
so it's basically called it's the term that we use. Sorry, Alice. The term that we use is concurrent rehabilitation, as opposed to closure after the mine has been, after production has ceased.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important factor, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges with historical tailings facilities, is that if rehabilitation is left till the end, there's insufficient funds available to do that rehabilitation if closure planning hasn't been done effectively. So concurrent rehabilitation is very important. But I think the other thing I just wanted to raise, Niël, is about location. I mean, a lot of those historical facilities, big towns, cities even have been built up around them, which poses a safety risk to people in close proximity to those facilities. And it also means that that's prime land. So if that tailings is removed and placed in alternative locations that at least now are less prime land, and obviously are managed from a safety aspect, that's got a double advantage as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like a real opportunity to be able to remine these facilities, get some income, and then to correct the mistakes that were made there and to build a better managed facility that can store the material and is designed with closure in mind. Now, when I imagine this, I imagine all these little facilities all over the show, and there's obviously a lot of equipment that's needed. Firstly, to remine this material, to pump it, and to process it, and I would like to bring Erik in at this point, and just to ask him just exactly what type of equipment is involved in these processes, and where does Weir Minerals stand in this value chain? You muted?
Thanks, Charles. I was indeed muted, so it's good that you say that. So yeah, thanks for putting that question up, because indeed, if you look at the tailings storage facilities where you have now stored all the valuable material, let's say, and you need to bring it back, then you need to start transferring the tailings to a central facility. You need to process it. It's multiple smaller sites. Usually over tens of kilometers, you need to transport the tailings to go to a processing site. And then you need to bring it back. So it first starts that you need to get the material solidified again, because that's what you usually do. So usually it is partners that play a role there with water jetting. So you make sure that all of that tailings is basically liquid again, so you can start pumping it, because pumping is usually still one of the best ways of transporting it. But then you need to start separating the material out, which can be in a variety of systems. But if you talk about cyclones or screening, and you talk about getting that stuff out, then that is the part where Weir will come in. So we have the brands like Morton, like Cavex, which are really recognized in that space. But then you bring the tailings back, and for example, some of these facilities then use cyclones to dewater the tailings again and to build the outside walls of the dams with stackable material, with dewatering cyclones. And I've been to Ergo site last year in December, which is one of the DRD sites, where you then see that with multiple smaller cyclones, you dewater the tailings again to get a stackable and stable material. But that is the traditional product approach, where you want to see, okay, I get equipment in, what do you do with it? So I think there are two developments in that space which are important to highlight. One of them is that as we now are saying, okay, we have these great products, but how can we do it better? How can we talk to our customers? How can we start talking to the people who understand what kind of a behavior I need at the TSF to have it stable and to have it stackable? So this is where we look at flow sheet development, as we call it. So we try to put these products in a certain follow or in a certain order, and then we try to look at, okay, what will give us a good solution for this application? So where can we reduce power, because power is usually limited? Where can we reduce water to transport the tailings from the sites? Where can we then increase densities, and where can we increase the let's say the PSD cuts, so we have a better opportunity to do it with one single piece of equipment, because all of this is handling solids, it's generating wear, and wear is what you don't want, because it's costing money for our customers and our operators. I think the second development that we really are looking at is, together with partners, we want to look at, can we do different ways than just use a lot of water to resolidify it? Can we do it with a smaller footprint, so that we use less water to resolidify it and bring it back in the same area? So a couple of these developments are not only done by Weir, but we then have a partner network where we try to work together with, so not only to focus on a piece of machine, but we really want to try to look at the full solution together with other partners that understand how the geotech behavior is and how we can do all of that things.
Thanks. It sounds like there's a lot of equipment involved, and there is obviously, and Niël, you mentioned this earlier about just sort of the throughput and the costs required to reprocess this. So maybe a question to you: how do you actually balance the costs associated with particularly the environmental, social, governance, commercial, all these aspects? Is it something that can be done successfully?
Yeah,
how do you do that?
Yeah, we're fortunate in South Africa and the footprint where we're operating, that just the size of the resource, 120 odd years of tailings accumulation on surface. I'm not aware of many other opportunities like that globally, where so much has been accumulated in such a small area. And once you've got that, once you've got a resource that's of adequate size, then it's a matter of setting up the technology, setting up the logistical infrastructure in such a way that you can process it at the requisite throughput rate. And ultimately, what you want to try and do in order for this to be commercially feasible is you want to find that point where the volume throughput, the extraction efficiency, the residence time, where all of those, where they converge, so that your cost line can consistently remain below the revenue line. And that's the sort of thing that we've managed to achieve here in South Africa, just in terms of the commercial setup. In terms of what Kim also referred to earlier as a social license, and operating within a built-up area, operating within a large community, and our mine is that's where we're operating is in the middle of Johannesburg. A city over the years, over the decades, a city was established around these tailings and around these operations. You've got to be mindful of that and have actual programs that can, over time, have an impact, a positive impact on the quality of life of those communities. And it's not a political game that you play, it's a long-term sustainability game in terms of incrementally and over time creating an environment that is healthier and that is at least more pleasant within which to live. Most of the communities that live around tailings dams live there because they don't really have many options. If you're going to choose, do I want to live right next to an old mine dump or not live next to an old mine dump, then obviously you'll go with the latter. And many communities were in fact moved into close proximity of those mine dumps over the years. And in the latter years, unfortunately, there's been poor controls in terms of the establishment of communities right next to old mine dumps. So you need to implement measures that over time can sustainably improve the quality of life of those communities. And then you do that in one of two ways. The first way is what we do in terms of reclaiming material is you remove the source of nuisance. So you pick it up, you put it through a plant, and you take it somewhere else. And over time, that site would have been cleared. And then, of course, you want to make sure that it is put to sustainable use, that you don't replace a previous and earlier problem with a new problem. So you don't want it to become a site where building refuse is dumped or where an informal settlement springs up or something like that. So there's also a process with a landowner to ensure that this land is put to good use. And I must say that I think most of the 200-odd sites that we've cleared over the last, I don't know how many years, 25 years or so, that most of those sites, that's been the route that they've followed. And we do try to exercise due diligence in ensuring that you don't replace one problem with another. The second way of dealing with that, obviously, is also to ensure that the permanent TSF, the final storage facility, where your material ultimately finds its way onto, that facility is managed to a particular set of standards. And just by way of an example, the Brakpan tailings facility, which is out in the far east rand, which Erik referred to, where we use these smaller cyclones as part of the sidewall or the daywall construction rather, that tailings dam has been revegetated over the last 12, 15 odd years. And I remember doing a calculation about 6 or 7 years ago when just adding up the numbers over the previous 10 years or so of cladding and vegetating that dam. And it transpired that we had spent more time on that exercise, that and also the other tailings facility that we have closer to Soweto, but essentially an environmental containment exercise, that they had spent more money on that than we had paid out in dividends. And that's the sort of decision that you've got to take early on in the cycle of this project, that you will do what's necessary to ensure that by the time that the project's finished, the rehabilitation is done. If you don't do that, notwithstanding the fact that standards were breached in terms of the proximity of communities and so forth, that's never an excuse. The reality is that people now live a lot closer to these facilities than what they used to, as a consequence of which different standards need to apply. And if you want to continue mining there, you have to adapt to those standards and do what's necessary to ensure that you don't have all this dust being blown off these facilities and into the surrounding community. So it's an adoption and an adherence to this idea of concurrent rehabilitation from a very early stage in the life of that program.
Yeah, it's wonderful listening to you talk about these things. But just having a look at some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A, there often is a hesitancy from society, or maybe not a hesitancy, but a society maybe questions whether we actually are living up to what we are saying. So maybe a question to Kim, and particularly the SAIMM, just to understand what role are they playing to give society the assurance that something is being done about tailings. What initiatives are on the go there to do that?
Thank you, Charles. So, as I'm sure most of the audience is aware, after Brumadinho, there was a movement started in Europe and the United States to launch the Global Industrial Standards for Tailings Management, the GISTM. And there's been amazing uptake of those standards that had a huge amount of effort put into them, not only by the United Nations, but also the International Council of Mining and Metallurgy, with feedback from investors all over the world. And what the SAIMM have been doing is updating our local standard, the SANS 10286, if you can remember 10286. We're updating that SANS, and that's being updated by a very powerful committee of people like John Waits, of Andrew Copeland, of James Dutchman, through the SAICE as well as the SAIMM. And those standards have been updated, and they're now with SANS. And then they'll be going out for public consultation, so that the South African standards, which, as Niël highlighted, we have a huge amount of tailings close to people living in South Africa. And we are unique in that we have so much per head of population. Probably only next nearest would be Ghana, for example. And it's important that we get public feedback on that. And the SAIMM is driving that, so that our local standards are aligned with the global standards. And of course, the global standards are very expensive to keep up with. And the SANS, our local one, is much easier for our our junior miners to adhere to, because they are specifically designed for South Africa. So we are aligning what's been going on in the world internationally with what should be done locally. And what's significant about the GISTM is they're also planning on launching an institute for tailings management. And believe it or not, the CEO of the International Council of Mining Metallurgists is a Joburg boy. Rohish Diwan is from Johannesburg. So South Africa is very close to his heart. And there's moves afoot to get the institute established here. Because as we know, with the weak rand, international funding gets far more bang for their buck locally. So I think watch this space. We're pushing quite hard for the institute perhaps to be located here. And then we'll again be leaders on tailings management from a Johannesburg base. So we also have another conference coming up next year on tailings. The previous conference in Johannesburg was very, very well attended. We had nearly 800 people from around the world discussing tailings, with a particular bent on rehabilitation and management of it. And that conference will happen again soon. And we have, as you know, through a virtual platform, we have a lot of international interests as well. So I think the SAIMM is doing its best not only to raise knowledge in the public and obviously the practitioners across the industry, but also raise standards throughout the industry.
Yeah, I'm also a part of some of those SAIMM activities, I know a substantial document has been written, but it's just trying to get it through the final stages. That is proving quite difficult. And hopefully, maybe some of those people listening to this will be able to join with us and to get that standard through. My next question is to Alice. One of the requirements of these new standards, or even in fact legislation in South Africa, is that those people who are specialists or who are qualified to provide input on these different factors are actually consulted. So my question is, are you seeing mining houses or mining companies turn to experts like yourself to get advice on how to remine and to build new facilities and to rehabilitate old facilities correctly?
So I think, yeah, I mean, Charles Jones Wagener isn't involved in the remining space, but we are extensively involved in operating in the monitoring of facilities, surveillance. We are involved in the closure and rehabilitation space once the tailings is redeposited, and of course can give specialist input on that. But I think the question is, it depends on which miners we're talking about. So I think top tier miners are typically trying to comply with standards like the GISTM. The GISTM calls for the appointment of suitably qualified individuals to fulfill certain roles like engineer of record. Engineer of record carries a high degree of responsibility. So those top tier miners, yes, they are getting expertise, consultations from consultants with relevant experience. But I think we're still seeing that a lot of the more junior miners, whether that's from a cost perspective or not, are not necessarily complying with things like GISTM or best practice standards, and not necessarily seeking the relevant specialist input into their designs and into things like rehabilitation.
Yeah, and hopefully that is a situation that changes, and that everyone in the mining sector starts to look to get the right information to guide their decisions. This is a question that's coming from the chat, and I'm going to ask Erik perhaps this question first. And there's been a lot of talk within the tailings fraternity about filtered tailings. Is that something that Weir Minerals is looking into? Is that something that you can elaborate on?
Yes, certainly. So from an equipment point of view and from a flow sheet perspective, I can do that. So I can only comment generally probably on the results, but then I would leave that to probably Alice and Kim to basically really go on the geotech background. But we talked a little bit earlier about that we want to look at the various options that we want to present and we want to discuss. So first of all, we want to understand from a customer what their constraints are, and then we want to talk about flow sheet options. Filter tailings is one of those options. So it's one of those options where you take out most of the water, where you then store the tailings in a manner that you want to have it stackable. And I am really not saying it's dry stackable, but you want to take it stackable. But over the course of the last few years, we have also heard feedback from big other mining companies like Vale and Rio Tinto that they really struggle with filter tailings. So although the initial thought behind it is really good, you see that operationally it's very difficult to achieve high throughputs, to achieve stable product that you want to store. And if there is one thing that we all know from the tailing storage facility problems, is that if you do not have a reliable product which you store, and you have too much variety in solids concentrations and in segregation of particle sizes, then it is difficult to basically keep on monitoring it. So we have heard that back from the industry, and this is where we take filter tailings into consideration, but we also take into consideration that we look at different methods of getting the tailings over to the TSF. We talk about discrete tailings, where we separate coarse tailings and fine tailings, and we dewater the coarse tailings in a different way, for example, with cyclones, compared to the fine tailings that we might be doing with not a filter press, but maybe a disc filter. And then you can use part of the coarse tailings to build construction walls again. And then you can also still have the operational flexibility to combine the two streams back and have more like a paste disposal system. So we try to combine all of that together. But not only that, we also try to digitize our equipment more and more. So if we want to run a stable product, so we see tailings not so much as a waste stream that you don't monitor, but as a product, you want to monitor the quality of your product. So we put in more digital technology in our machines to understand whether we are running at the right consistency. And we want to run a predictable product. And that is part of the whole digital development that we are doing on the machines, but also in the process, so we can take that on board. And that is something which we do not only see in South Africa, but we see this on a global basis. So to jump a little bit back to Niël's earlier question, globally we see that there is much more attention for remining of tailings, We know in Canada there is a big campaign going on to inventarize everything which is there on the reclaimed tailings. We know the same thing is happening in Australia. So as this is expanding globally, there will be more innovation in the solutions that we can apply in South Africa as well, because there is a lot of focus on it.
Yeah, so there are all these different technologies that are becoming available to manage this tailings. Maybe just quickly, Niël, are you considering any of these new technologies?
But the design that we have for our future tailings dam, the one now, is pretty much based on conventional methodologies. We do need the coarser material for the outer walls, for the construction of the outer walls. I would imagine the more recent standards have come in was making sure that we strike the right balance between the containment of the facility in terms of its impact on the surrounding environment and groundwater in particular, whilst at the same time also building a dam or a facility that is safe. So that's really where a lot of the design thinking and the technology thinking has gone into. But in terms of dry stacking and filter tailings and so forth, at the rate and the scale that we're producing, I think there still needs to be a bit of work done before that will find its way into our model.
Thanks. Alice, just coming to you from a sort of an environmental point of view, some of the questions that have been raised in the chat are these facilities that are remined, those footprints, do they become available for reuse? And what types of reuse are possible?
I think that's one that Niël can also comment on. But yeah, I mean, that I did refer to it as becoming available for reuse. So I think there's two things. I mean, we've talked a lot about the remining, but existing tailings facilities can also be rehabilitated in situ and effective reuse. There are ways to effectively reuse that land if the closure and rehabilitation is done carefully. But those footprints also, yes, there would need to be a contaminated land assessment to understand what the impact on that footprint is and to do a cleanup exercise in that area. But effectively, once the tailings is gone and that contaminated land assessment has been completed and contamination has been removed, there's no reason why those cannot be used for a variety of alternative applications. And obviously that post-closure land use should be defined early on, so that once we get to that point, we understand what is required from that footprint. So for example, if it's going to be, let's say, used for agriculture, the requirements for those soils and the amelioration would be very different from if we're going to be constructing buildings in that area. But yes, that can be become available for reuse.
And for agricultural purposes, is that?
So again, I think it depends, as we said, on the contamination land assessment. If that footprint is effectively cleaned, so on those footprints and on some of our TSFs, what is happening is that we, depending on what's required, you would sometimes bring in things like topsoil. So we have facilities in Ghana, for example, where they are growing agriculture on TSF. So if you bring in your soils and if you ameliorate sufficiently so that your fertilizers and so on, then it can be used. But obviously it needs to be monitored and the crops need to be carefully selected. So in one of our facilities in Ghana, they are monitoring the vegetation and they are picking up heavy metals in that vegetation because the plants are picking up the heavy metals from the TSF itself. So all of these things need to be considered, and you need to be careful about what crops are grown there and whether they are going to be used for human consumption or what the alternatives are, in particular on a tailings facility, on a rehabilitated footprint. Obviously, if the tailings have been completely removed and the contamination source is removed, then that should be very low risk.
I must say that's been pretty much our experience as well, Charles. In the early days in Johannesburg, a lot of the early mine dumps found their way into streams. Because remember, the mines that caused the dewatering of those areas, and it wasn't a mechanical era, it was talking late 1800s, early 1900s. So waste were disposed of with carts that were pulled by mules. So the full cart goes downhill, the empty cart goes back uphill. So a lot of tailings found their way into lower lying areas, into flay areas and into watercourses. And those when they are cleaned out, when they've been mined out, they simply go back to their natural state. So you don't use them for anything, you've just restored nature. You've restored that ecosystem, and you see a return of bird life and all sorts of other animal and insect species. But then there are many other sites in and around the Johannesburg area that we've cleaned up that have been used either for light commercial and some even for residential purposes. Most of those sites do get reused sustainably. And ultimately what you have to produce before it can be used for that purpose is a clearance certificate from the NNR, so from the nuclear regulator. It's very seldom that you get a closure certificate from a rehabilitation perspective from the regulator. Talk about the DMR, but the radiation clearance certificate, those are issued I wouldn't say as a matter of course, but if you achieve the standard, then those are issued, and then the land is being put to use. And there's several hundreds of hectares in and around Johannesburg that we can attest to that have in fact been used in that regard.
That was one of the questions that was raised, is around closure certificates. Are you or anyone on the panel can also comment aware of operations that have received closure certificates?
Look, we have a single mining authorization, or in other instances an environmental approval to retreat these tailings. So some of the old order rights that we had, those were converted into new order rights. In terms of the new dispensation, you don't get mining rights, but you can get an environmental authorization, which means that there has to be a certain condition in terms of the state that the site is in once you've done, and the description of your activity involves the impact that it has on the environment. So it's a removal and then subsequently the cleanup of the site. Closure certificate, that's something that I've never seen one. I've never had the privilege of holding one in my hands, but what I have seen regularly on nuclear, the nuclear licenses, the radiation certificates confirming that it's no longer a nuclear site, and then typically development can take place. It doesn't get in the way of the development of the site. It does come with a measure of environmental risk, but I don't think there's an environmental risk from a DMR or a minerals regulator perspective when what you're looking at is an industrial park. It's not the sort of thing that I think necessarily introduces any kind of risk. So we can get by that. Pragmatically, we can get by that. So sorry.
Okay.
Charles, if I can maybe also just respond on closure certificates. I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges we see in this industry at the moment, particularly of rehabilitation of existing facilities that aren't going to be remined, is that we're getting very few closure certificates. Some have been issued. I think they're all in the Western Cape, and they're typically for small operations, things like quarries. We're not seeing closure certificates being issued for any of our big mines. And it's a significant problem because it doesn't incentivize mines to rehabilitate their facilities. And so for a variety of reasons, but partly because of a challenge around closure certificates, is we're getting what is sometimes referred to as a pass the parcel approach on these facilities. So once the top tier miners have finished mining to the extent that they feel is economically viable, they sell on to mid and junior tier miners who sell on. And sometimes that even gets to the point where it's either abandoned or the final miner goes bankrupt. And we've seen issues around the closure provisioning not being ring-fenced from creditors. So that money then goes to creditors, and then government sits with another abandoned facility that hasn't been rehabilitated and that doesn't have funds to rehabilitate or close it. So yeah, it is one of the big challenges in this industry is that we're not getting closure certificates.
I don't know, Kim, do you want to add anything to that, or?
No, it is an ongoing problem, and I think it's something we just have to live with. I can't see our government taking a stronger lead in this. So it really is up to the individual's conscience and the mining companies' consciences to actually try and improve how they leave what's behind.
Okay, we getting, I'm just going through the questions here just to see if there are any, maybe, Kim, you mentioned sort of alternative uses for these mine residue streams. Would you like to elaborate on some of those?
Well, it really is, how long is a piece of string? The use of stuff that's already been graded into a sand-sized particle is really up to the imagination. And I see we've got a couple of people joining us in the webinar that are already remining tailings. We've certainly seen where the tailings are not radioactive being used for brickwork, or being used for building sand, for using for construction. But of course, as you highlighted right at the beginning, this reprocessing to get out the molecular gold is quite an exciting space. What is happening across the industry, and I'm getting a lot of clients worldwide, is using more backfill. And I see in the new mines I work on there's a steady stream of companies going straight underground, not open pit, because that means you use less and less waste rock. So using an underground mine and then backfilling as you go is basically building a tailings dam underground. So that is building huge impetus around the world. I think you've seen in Congo, Committe, for example, it didn't even consider going open pit. It went straight underground, and the backfill there is being used to backfill the open stopes and increase their extraction. Because once you backfill, it means you can go for more extraction because you're strengthening. I've seen the same in Russia. I've seen the same in Mozambique, and it's also happening in South Africa. I've got projects in Idaho where backfill. So it's not just building materials, but actually using it to strengthen the mine underground and increase extraction. And that seems to be a worldwide phenomenon. We're getting more and more technically astute. I think cloud-based decision making is meaning you're bringing in crowd decisions, and I think innovation is happening faster and faster. I'm sure Niël's seen the speed of innovation in the mining industry increase. So that would be a major comment, that the usage at the moment is in backfill.
Erik,
Charles, I can actually.
Yep.
Charles, I can actually add to that. So one of the things that we see as Weir is, if you look at base backfill systems, what Dr. Kim is referring to. Indeed, globally, it's really picking up in Australia and Canada, where you see for all the advantages, as you just highlighted, recovery of the underground mine, you get the strength back, but you store your tailings underground. That is really picking up significantly, where we also see that is one of the solutions that by default, they want us to do research upon and offer systems for that. So that is indeed, I can back that up. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, so backfill is obviously another option that is available. Perhaps just looking if there's quite a number of questions has come through, and it's just difficult to decide which one to go for. But maybe we've got about 5 minutes left. So maybe we'll just go around the room, starting with perhaps Niël, and just if there's any final comments that you would like to make and to add to this discussion to close it off.
Certainly, Charles. And maybe just reflect on the comment that was made earlier with regards to the on-selling of mining operations and that they're being transferred sort of progressively into a weaker set of hands. I think what you're finding increasingly amongst the sort of operations that you would want to be associated with, and those are most of the larger companies in South Africa, the attitude amongst executives and management, I think, has changed over time. And whereas in the past, your typical mining cycle would be one of finding a resource, developing it, mining it to sort of within 5 or 8 years of closure, and then on-selling it because it becomes non-core. And up until that point that you're selling it, your efforts in terms of environmental practice really more aimed towards containment of the environmental impact as opposed to the actual rehabilitation. I think that is part of a bygone era. There might still be some operators who sort of operate along those lines, but increasingly the attitude has become one of, we will mine this resource and then ultimately close the mine because we want our legacy to be a healthy legacy. You're finding increasingly also that some of those old sold assets are now featuring in litigation involving the original owner. So there's also an element of commercial risk and reputational risk associated with selling a mine into the wrong pair of hands. The dilemma, though, is that in not many instances is the final closure, the cost of final closure, other than the financial provision that's made, really factored into the model. So when you go to your funders to build the mine, the actual cost of concurrent rehabilitation, so that rehab is done the day that the mining is done or shortly thereafter, that doesn't really find its way into the model. So suddenly you've now changed, you've had a change of heart, change of strategy, we're going to close this mine, but the model is still the model, and the financial reality is the financial reality. And I think that's really where mine tailings and the recycling of mine tailings, the remining of mine tailings can play a prominent role. People are very excited about the commercial potential of mining tailings in the context of a business. But I think its true value really lies in dealing with that legacy and dealing with that distortion that's found its way into the model. So if you as an operator, if you identify your tailings early on as a source of currency, which you can apply towards responsible mine closure, and you start early enough, and you're not too greedy, you're happy to actually apply towards that, then a multitude of all of these problems that we create, these legacy problems, will have been avoided altogether. It's just that mindset change is necessary. So terminology, language like concurrent rehabilitation and optimizing old infrastructure and using tailings as currency towards environmental closure, to use that to reestablish the ecosystem that will support the natural biodiversity of their site. If that kind of language can find its way into the strategy room, and if the CEO and CFO and Chief Operating Officer and the board, if they start thinking about their tailings within that context, I think a lot of the bad legacy which we have to carry now, we have a bad history because of all the stuff that we did in the past, all the things that we didn't do. I think the future generation will not sit with that situation if that's the kind of attitude and language that we start introducing into our thinking, into our strategic thinking as miners. Or else we're also always going to have to start conversations when we are accused of all these things with yes, but. I don't want to use yes, but anymore. I want to be able to say, this is who we are and that's what we've done.
Alice?
Yeah, I think that's a hard act to follow. Niël's given a good speech there. I think we're still seeing a lot of those legacy issues. As we referred to earlier, mines that sit towards the end of life of mine and haven't got the financial provision to close those facilities. I think newer facilities and those bigger mines, I think the mindset is changing. And we hope that there is going to be a big change and shift. And I think particularly on newer facilities, for example, when you've remined and you're designing a new facility, our big push when we do design now is to try and design for closure. So have closure in mind all along, and that's not just rehabilitating the side slopes with some grass as you go, but it's much more economically efficient to think about closure right at the start, as you say, bring it into the boardroom, into the financial planning, but also into the designs of those facilities. Think about what the post-closure land use looks like, so that we can effectively design those facilities for closure right from the start, rather than be trying to put a band-aid on on the problem at the end when there's not much money left.
Erik?
Yeah, so what I see is the discussions that we had today just highlights how you have to connect all the dots together. So it's not only looking for a piece of the puzzle, you look at all of the aspects and you try to connect everybody together so they look at these sites and projects in a more holistic way, and then try to come up with the best solutions. And we all need to work together in the mining industry like that. And I think then that is where the future lies. Absolutely.
Finally, Kim?
I think a great saying in England is where there's muck, there's brass. In America, they call it where there's dirt, there's dollar. In all residue, there's opportunity. And I think definitely in Southern Africa, we're embracing the opportunity to use the mine residue and benefit mine closure and benefit communities in the area. So thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Niël, Alice, Erik, and Kim. We've come to the end of this webinar, and I'd like to hand back to Shannon.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to you, Charles, for enabling a very fascinating discussion. Thank you also to our panelists, Niël Pretorius from DRDGOLD, Alice Harvey from Jones and Wagener, Erik Vlot from Weir Minerals, and Dr. Kim Morton from the Southern African Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. Thank you very much to our sponsors, DRDGOLD, Weir Minerals Africa, and Jones and Wagener for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on the growth potential of tailings retreatment and rehabilitation. We hope you found this event engaging and informative. We really appreciate your participation. The next webinar takes place on the 24th of April at 2 p.m. I will share that link in the chat. It will discuss advancing South Africa's world-class mining technology. So if you're interested in that, we'd like to see you in that one too. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you soon. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you for your time and goodbye.